Good afternoon, everyone. Please continue to enjoy your lunches. I'm glad that both Jason and I do not have to stand between you and eating. Just make sure, take the next minute or two to cut up all those carrots and asparagus if you have them, and then put your knives down, and then we'll be ready for Jason's presentation. I'm John Goen. I am the Assistant Director for Transportation Planning at Hennepin County. I also play a role at a startup company called Mobility for All. As you might have heard in the previous session, we are the kinder, gentler Uber for seniors and people with disabilities. I've got the great distinction to welcome Jason Levine, who is a consumer protection advocate and who's held leadership positions in multiple federal agencies and is active on a number of nonprofit boards throughout the country. He plays, I think, a very crucial role in making sure that consumers are at the forefront of technology as it advances into the future. He is the third executive director at the Center for Auto Safety, which has a 5-decade-long history of consumer protection. Under his leadership, the center is fighting in court for consumers against secret settlements by the auto industry and for the safety by litigation to force the DOT to issue required rulemakings. The center continues its long tradition of working for people and consumers by working towards higher recall completion rates, including leading a successful campaign earlier this year to have some recalls for stalling of the 2017 Chrysler Pacifica minivan, which I should also point out is also the preferred platform for Waymo's autonomous vehicle. The center is also an advocate for the Safer Climate campaign, which is looking to increase fuel economy in new vehicles. Prior to joining the center, Jason served as a director of the Office of Congressional, Legislative, and Intergovernmental Affairs at the U.S. Office of Personnel Management. He was the lead in the Obama administration for the response to Congress after the highly publicized cyber security breaches of federal employee data in 2015. He's a graduate of the law school at UConn and also has a degree from Northwestern. So we are really excited to hear some counterpoints probably to what we heard this morning with regards to how we move forward into this autonomous vehicle future. With that, please welcome Jason to the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, John, for that very kind introduction. I had a chance to hear some of the presentations this morning and seen the agenda for the rest of the program. Unfortunately, I won't be able to stay till tomorrow, but I do really want to commend Lori and Chelsea and the whole team for putting together a great workshop. It's not easy to pack 2 full days full of a lot of impressive speakers and panels on topics, particularly one for which no commercially available product even currently exists. Now, I know you've still got some food in front of you and you've been going since 8:30 this morning, so I'll try to be as enthusiastic as I can be. I promise not to read any PowerPoint slides at you, and the hopes we can delay the inevitable food coma that I'm sure is coming down the road. So, as John mentioned, my name is Jason Levine. I am the Executive Director of the Center for Auto Safety, and on behalf of the Center and all of our members across the country, I want to thank you for having us here today. As a consumer representative, it's really refreshing to have a chance to be in a room with so many stakeholders in the driverless car debate, from the AV industry to academia, from government regulators to private sector consumers of the technology. The truth is, without all of our stakeholders working together in one form or another, the likelihood of success for this next generation technology is going to be greatly diminished, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I want to speak briefly about the work of the center, not only because I have some slides about it, but because I think knowing where we're coming from provides important context for our positions on AV development. And also it helps understand our ideas of what the future of AV should look like because they're firmly rooted in our past experience. So our mission, we were founded in 1970 by Ralph Nader and Consumers Union. From that golden moment in the late 1960s for consumer activism, a number of influential and still operating nonprofit organizations were born. You probably recognize many of the names. The best known include the Public Interest Research Group, or PIRG. Public Citizen is also one of the more well-known organizations. The Center for Auto Safety is another branch from that tree. So we were created to be an independent watchdog and advocate for auto safety, quality, and fuel economy at a moment when there really was no one whose sole purpose was to advocate just for consumers. Now, there's no question over the last 50 years there's been significant improvements in auto safety. The death rate per 100 million vehicle miles traveled in the United States has dropped from over 5 in 1969 to just under 1.2 today. Yet, there are still more than 37,000 deaths a year in the United States from traffic crashes, a number, of course, which pales compared to the 1.2 million annual deaths worldwide. There are still over 2 million serious injuries every year from traffic crashes in the United States. And perhaps most startling is that traffic deaths in the US remain the leading killer of 5 to 24-year-olds. It's also disturbing that the rate and sheer number of pedestrians and bicyclists being killed has increased almost 25% over the last 4 years. Now, over the last 5 decades, the center is proud to have helped make our cars and roads safer in a variety of ways. At times, we found success pushing for stronger motor vehicle safety standards for new vehicles, while in other instances, we have worked at the local level by leading the charge for lemon laws in every state, hence the lemon in our logo. We're perhaps best known for finding defects, pushing for recalls for defective vehicles, and pushing even harder for public awareness of those recalls. And everyone should know, if you don't already, recall repairs are free. If you have a recall, please bring it in and get it done. Our work on standards, lemon laws for defective vehicles, and recalls highlights the reality that safety must not only be a consideration before a car hits the showroom floor, but remains an ongoing concern even when it is in your driveway or rolling down your street. Now, our dual mission of focusing on the safety of cars on the road today, as well as the cars yet to be built, intertwines closely with an understanding that how cars are made may be decided at a national level, but how vehicles are used happens at the local level. It's with these concerns in mind that we have formulated our ideas on autonomous vehicles. We recognize, for example, not only the tremendous safety potential, but the mobility potential of driverless technology for some very large communities, whether it be the disabled who've never had their own mobility options, or seniors who can no longer drive and have functionally become shut-ins due to loss of driving ability. Obviously, these and other communities could greatly benefit from a future with safe autonomous vehicles. But we are, after all, the Center for Auto Safety, and that is where our focus continues to be. As an independent, nonprofit, data-driven organization, we go where the facts take us. And what the facts are telling us right now is there's a rush to get legislation passed at the national level that may wind up being a bad deal for consumers. I would note that we don't necessarily disagree with some of the proponents of autonomous technology who argue that the main problem with cars today are the drivers. Yet we take the position that replacing deaths and injuries caused by human drivers with deaths and injuries caused by computer drivers is not a trade-off that automatically improves current conditions. The goal is to mitigate and ideally eliminate the deaths and injuries from crashes, regardless of who or what is driving. Smart city and state planning requires advanced thinking. So congratulations to you for being here and having this conference this week. Your desire to get ahead of the curve on AV is an admirable one, and the same idea animates many of our actions as well. And there's no question autonomy as transportation is coming. That's why billions of dollars are being invested in both traditional and non-traditional auto players in the AV technology. And as you can imagine, we wound up spending a lot of time talking about driverless cars. And one of our recurring refrains as we talk about AV is the importance of establishing certain levels of safety before the public deployment of these vehicles. So what I thought I'd talk about today is one possible mechanism by which industry and the public together could go about trying to establish the safety of the vehicles before they get on the road. Now, there are surely other ways of achieving the same goal, but continuing not to require any proof of safety is what we have now, which has led to a bit of a wild, wild west atmosphere. Now, our plan for how to encourage the safe development of AV is not a unique one, and in fact, it's based on concepts regularly used in the safe development and deployment of a lot of technologies. It's called gated certification. So let's start with the following premise. Autonomous vehicles for public road transportation have no precedent in world history. Certain transportation assets have been automated with mixed success, but only in controlled environments, generally away from the general public until their safety was validated. Automated trains, ships, and planes on autopilot, chemical processing facilities, even automated mail delivery systems and businesses are all excluded from operation on highways, cities, and neighborhoods where we and our children live and play and work and drive. The assets are extensively tested in the restricted environments of their intended use and go through an extensive qualification process with proven backups for human intervention in the event of failures to prevent catastrophe. They all carry insurance or an equivalent financial guarantee on their intended use, potential harm, and likelihood of failure. Currently, the development of AV is proceeding on public roads without any demonstration of safety, without any regard to public exposure to the hazards they cause, and without comprehensive requirements for insurance or financial guarantees against the hazard presented by the technology. Now, as we saw with the Uber crash in Arizona in March, the vehicles do not have proven transition to human control to avoid catastrophe. And it's not clear that presuming a person paying attention could even avert a crash at 40 miles an hour. And what we've seen now is when they're not paying attention, the results can clearly be tragic. But even on nominal level 2 vehicles, such as the Tesla and some of its competitors, we are seeing injuries and deaths due to human over-reliance on the capabilities the operator believed to be autonomous. These shortcomings have also caused collisions with stationary objects, including emergency vehicles, other motorists, cars, motorcycles. And let's remember there are 270 million human-driven vehicles registered in the United States right now that aren't going anywhere anytime soon. So, as a matter of policy, our position is the public should not be unwitting participants in AV engineering development tests. AV developers should provide full disclosure of the state of development, test plans, the risks of public safety caused by those test plans, and the financial resources available to compensate the public should crashes occur. These steps should be taken prior to deployment. AV developers should also participate in objective, unbiased public review of AV development and deployment risks, present their mitigation plans and their guarantees, and coordinate these test plans with all levels of government affected by those plans, particularly at the state and local level. Because in addition to any mandatory federal in addition to a lack of any mandatory federal standards for AV safety, there's a lack of any even being considered by Congress right now or the Department of Transportation. Another impediment to an open public process of AV risk review is that there are no currently accepted industry-wide standards for AV safety. There's also no accepted process for even confirming that AVs are conforming to a manufacturer's announced standards. So, considering the recent developmental crashes causing injuries and deaths, this is a void where standards should be, and we think that it's inhibiting AV development in a safe way. The very real safety questions that arise from these crashes, they interrupt testing, they reduce public confidence, and they invite piecemeal legislative remedies. The many local, state, and public advocacy and federal stakeholders in AV operational safety and this balkanized approach of developers to addressing these different viewpoints beg for a rational process acceptable to all. So this is why the Center for Auto Safety is advocating for the development of a gated certification process, which would be applied to autonomous vehicles to fill that need for establishing public confidence in AV safety. It would address concerns about regulatory inputs, industrial needs, and public safety. The elements of gated certification would include a comprehensive set of safety standards and a stepwise certification process that respects both the needs of developers at different stages of development and the public interest in transparency, the breadth of safety considerations, and public safety. So, what is gated certification? So when we talk about general certification today, right, it's a disciplined process by which knowledgeable third-party documents and engineering development conforms to a set of requirements. This approach is commonly used in complex projects that expose the public to risk. Think about FAA certification of airlines, the Coast Guard certification of ships, professional engineer certification of civil engineering structures, underwriter's laboratory certification of electrical devices, elevator inspections, the list goes on and on. Certification for public use may be accomplished by government officials, private entities licensed by the government, private agencies delegated authority by the appropriate government body, or sometimes just by a manufacturer. Certification typically does not involve proprietary features, except to the extent that they potentially impact public safety. Gated certification is a process for evaluating compliance with standards at certain points in development as appropriate for that developmental level before allowing it to proceed to the next phase. Many complex engineering developments are based on gated certification to make sure that safety, engineering performance, engineering performance and financial targets have been reached before committing to the succeeding developmental level. Clearly, autonomous vehicle technology is a complex engineering project and presents significant risks to public safety and property. The public needs to be fully aware of the related technical, financial, and legal issues, which I heard was discussed in the last sessions, before AV developers are being allowed access to public roads. Our concept is that at each gate, independent reviewers would certify that the developer has completed the work necessary to justify the use of public roads and related transportation assets for the next level of their AV development. The appeal of gated certification is being able to point to an objective process for making sure the engineering development in question, in this case, autonomous technology, conforms to a set of requirements which meet minimum principles for their design and intended use. We at the center have proposed such a set of principles, though we recognize others could just as easily be used. So in the interest of not trying to jam them all on one slide, not everything I'm going to read is up there, but those are probably the most important ones. So the first one being sort of the Hippocratic Oath for AVs. AV shall do no harm. Now, this is perhaps the most obvious of the list, but to us this means proving that SAE levels 2 through 5 technology are safer for both occupants and the public, and is as environmentally benign as the equivalent or comparable model year technology available in a full-time human-operated vehicle without that AV technology. AV shall provide crash safety. Now, Tim mentioned this morning, but the idea that manufacturers would be, you can't use the campfire seating. For those who haven't seen the pictures, right, the seats face in as opposed to having your rows. You can't do that without proving that it's safer in collisions for all occupants, emergency responders, and recovery personnel as compared to your conventional new vehicle. It may not be the most attractive, and you certainly can't light a campfire in the middle, but there's a reason the seats are positioned the way they are, and we've developed a lot of safety around that. That decline from 5 deaths per 100 million to 1.2, a lot of that is based on technology that's been developed around crash safety, crumple zones. We need to make sure it's safe. Hopefully it is. We need to make sure it is. AVs shall provide verifiable, safe operational capability. You got to prove the AV can identify and safely mitigate any hardware, and this would include fire and mechanical problems, software problems, communications, or data processing faults that might arise before, during, or after passenger transport. The AV shall always defer to commands by the designated occupant. You need to prove the AV will override pre-programmed or remote operational commands in favor of commands by the designated occupant. That the AV can discriminate between commands by the designated occupant and other occupants and ignore the commands by others. What we don't want, I have an 11 and an 8-year-old, we don't want the kids in the back who think it might be fun to shout voice commands like, Alexa, ice cream, and then have the thing go at 80 miles an hour across 2 lanes to get to the exit to get to the next Baskin-Robbins. Now, but at the same time, that designated occupant must be able to reassign operational control responsibility to another in case of an emergency. The AV shall respond promptly and appropriately to emergency and public safety vehicles. I know that's been discussed a little bit, but think fire trucks, ambulances, other first responders. Are all the AVs in every community? Those things can be different, those sounds can be different. How are you going to respond to that fire truck? How are you going to get out of the way? How are you going to know that you're the one who needs to pull over? The AVs shall safely transition to occupant control. Prove that AVs equipped for primary or optional human operational control have suitable control devices, provide human operators with sufficient time and situational awareness to take over control, and have a default safe shutdown capability if the human operator cannot or does not take over control safely. Again, I'd point back to the really startling video that we saw out of Arizona where the operator was not in a position to successfully take over control because was given 1.2 seconds, apparently, to do so. Again, even if she had been paying attention, it's not clear that she would have been able to do very much anyway. The AVs shall assure occupant situational awareness and safe egress. Cybersecurity. We want the AVs to be able to provide cybersecurity. You need to be able to prove the AV data processing is secure, reliable, and uncompromised by communication faults, whether caused by communication equipment, terrain, weather. It can't be spoofed or sent to misdirection, and malignant software, firmware, or other logic-bearing components cannot be resident in the AV and still be allowed to be on our streets. The AVs shall respect their mechanically limited and logically limited geographic operational limits. Now, this may be amongst the most important things. We want to see it demonstrated that the AV cannot be directed to destinations, conditions, or terrain that are outside of its safe automatic operational envelope. It can't be pre-programmed to endanger passengers by routing to a dangerous destination outside of these limits, that occupants or controllers will receive appropriate notification of vehicle fuel, you're going to run out of gas, or performance limitations that inhibit executing destination instructions in time for them to effectively remediate the condition. And AV occupants need the opportunity to abandon that pre-programmed trip and redirect to a safe destination if necessary. AVs shall respect naturally occurring inclement weather and hazardous environmental conditions. Now, this one may engage some of the most local interests, and I again heard this discussed earlier. The typical environmental conditions here in Minnesota are likely to be different than those where these are being tested the most, which is Arizona and California. The requirement would be to prove the AV will respond safely to naturally occurring weather emergencies. Think thunderstorms, snowstorms, tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, flooded roads, and other suddenly emerging natural environment concerns, earthquakes, sinkholes, forest fires, solar or lunar interference that could interfere with your sensors. Because that's going to compromise occupant safety, even if those conditions start after you've left the house. It was clear when you left, then the tornado came. What are you going to do then? How is the car going to react then? AV shall appropriately respond to compromising, unusual, or undocumented artificial road conditions, potholes, flag persons, toll booths, whether or not they're automated, emergency road closures, sensor disabling glint from surfaces, other vehicles, stickers on stop signs. I know you guys have seen these videos, but some of the AV sensors, you put a stop sign, you put a sticker on a stop sign, it thinks it's now a 40-mile-an-hour sign as opposed to a stop sign. Now, I want to pause on those two, because some of you may be thinking, well, we're not making people prove on their driving tests that they know what to do in a flood. Now, that is true. So why would we do something, set the bar higher for AVs? Well, leaving aside where we started from the beginning, which is AV should be at least as good as what we have now, most people, no, not everyone, unfortunately, most people, when they see standing water, don't drive through it. Most people heed the warnings there. They avoid the danger. Most of us, if we hit a large pothole and the car shakes, we know how to regain control of the vehicle. Our point is that the AV should be like the best, most attentive drivers among us, even when the unexpected occurs, not just on a test track. Moving on. The AV shall protect occupants from uncontrolled or malicious drivers in other vehicles. In other words, is it going to be a good defensive driver? I want to point back to the 270 million human-driven cars. Cars stay on the road. We still get calls about cars from the 90s. Right? Cars stay on the road for a long time, particularly at the used level. Are you going to be a good defensive driver when humans are doing unpredictable things, which is what makes us all human? AV shall possess data recorders that provide sufficient pre- and post-crash data for crash investigators to access operational history necessary to understand the cause of that crash. Now, this is particularly true in vehicles from the level 3 to level 5. We want to see manufacturers provide capability to resolve the state of the AV prior to and immediately following the crash, provide sufficient detail on the speed, environmental conditions, programmed instructions, operational state, and user-selectable operational options, communications, software firmware configuration, everything you need to know to reconstruct that crash. And what we saw after both the initial reports of the Uber crash in Arizona and one of the Tesla crash in Mountain View, was a tremendous difficulty for our federal agencies attempting to get data from those companies about those crashes. And that does two things. One, it inhibits the investigation, obviously. But more importantly, from our perspective, is it the ability for the public to have confidence in AV technology is going to be dependent upon the ability to reconstruct and compare these crashes one to another. It may well be that certain companies are going to do an amazing job with this technology, and it may well be that others are going to do a terrible job with the technology. But to the public at large, it's just all robot cars. So how do we make sure that there's an understanding of what's working and what's not working? It turned out, if you remember, the moment that the crash in Arizona happened, the first thing was the pedestrian got blamed. Then the next thing was the driver got blamed. And then the next thing was the car got blamed. And now after the report came out last week, we're back to the driver being blamed and a little bit on the pedestrian. Now, the reality is probably all those things have a little bit of truth to it. But until we have an understanding of what worked and what didn't work, it's going to be very hard to convince the public to put their kids in the back of these things. Now, AVs shall detect and respond appropriately to collisions with humans or property that's associated with property damage, injury, or death, right? So we don't want hit and run cars. But we also need to understand that it's able to detect those collisions with humans or property, safely stop after the event, summon the emergency response, and allow the third party. Now, maybe these are victims, law enforcement officers, no electronic access to proprietary data, but you got to record that data for the collision for resolution of legal claims. Think about, when you exchange your license and registration insurance after a crash. How's that going to work in the AV context? AVs offered for sale or public use shall not be reliant upon unfunded, and this really goes to this group here, unfunded, incomplete, unvalidated, or future public or private investments to achieve the claim autonomous driving level or capability. Sure, we can do all that when 5G is in. Well, 5G is not here yet, so you don't get to deploy yet. You need to prove that it works based on what's available now before you get to be on the road now. So, and finally, you got to prove that they have the financial resources to cover the risks, including death, injury, or property damage that AV development testing and public use entail. So we believe meeting these principles is necessary to protect the public safety during AV development. We also believe that these are reasonable performance objectives. They don't present significant incremental engineering challenges to the AV developers, and they include some important societal requirements, particularly things like financial ability to cover those risks that are basic to most industries where lives could be at stake. We see these as guideposts. They're intended to lead to safe, efficient AV design, development, and use. Now, there's many examples of industry and government partnerships related to sophisticated system design and technology development. For one example, the FAA accepts the use of a privately developed standard known as DO 178C, which is an acceptable framework for aircraft cybersecurity. Another example of gated certification may be found in DoD 5000, operation of the Defense Acquisition System, where specific milestones include a preliminary design review, a critical design review, and a final design review by a panel of program officials, other government employees, and third-party experts who review and critique all aspects of the design's compliance with requirements and intended uses documented and presented by the developer. Another one is even closer to home, Department of Transportation and FAA, aircraft type certification process. In this process, either an FAA official or authorized representatives are allowed to issue a type of certificate. And perhaps most close to home is that right now, DOT is using SAE's vehicle automation levels, right? When we talk about SAE 1 through 5, DOT has blessed that, essentially, and it's voluntary AV guidance. Unfortunately, it's voluntary, not mandatory. But there's basically any document coming out of DOT that's talking about AV uses SAEs 1 through 5. So there's precedent for this sort of public-private partnership. And not just precedent, there's precedent within the AV context. In our gated certification process proposal, official review of AV certification could include the official data and presentations by the AV developer, and independent review by qualified third parties that assist that official review. They could include those third parties, public safety advocates, state, local, federal transportation officials to assure compliance in jurisdictions where the AV would be operated and therefore would be subject to applicable laws and regulations. So, not expecting to read, but this is sort of a graphic representation of how the gates would work. So, an AV developer would be free to do whatever it wanted on its own test track using its own personnel. Now, this is consistent with what they're doing now in current practice and current law. However, before leaving that test track and starting tests on public roads, the AV developer would need to pass through a gate and demonstrate that the AV was ready to be safely operated on public highways and neighborhoods. To pass gate 0, the AV developer would need to show that it's complied with all applicable safety requirements. Engineering issues have been defined and resolution plans are in place, and no injuries or deaths have occurred in the controlled environment. Safe operating environments, including geofencing, has been defined, and they can demonstrate proven confidence in the safe operation within the limits that it has defined. Now, once a developer passes through gate 0, which in practice means the certification authority, whatever that authority winds up being, has determined the AV developer has achieved the gate 0 criteria. The AV developer would then be granted by the appropriate public authority, whoever that may wind up being, access to geofence public roads for additional AV testing, license to test using company personnel or civilians who understand the risks Again, when you do a drug trial, no one's walking up on the street and just putting a needle in your arm. You sign up for that. You know what's happening. There's a lot of stuff going on with AVs in a lot of communities where people aren't even aware they're driving next to an AV. License to test only within the specified safe operating environments. Now, note that passing gate 0 doesn't mean you can't continue to test at your track. You can't continue to do simulation work. And you may well want to do additional private testing to meet the criteria in subsequent gates. You want to keep that test track moving. But once you do get to gate 1, the AV developer would need to show that they've maintained all the levels that they've reached in 0 and progress to the point where they can demonstrate proven confidence in use in unrestricted environments and geofences, that the issues, both engineering and safety-wise, have been resolved from previously, and new issues have resolution plans in place. No one's expecting everything to be perfect from day 1, but how are you going to deal with the problems you've already identified? What's your plan? But that could be across, that could be from battery to safety to cyber, whatever it might be. Do you have plans in place? And you need to start to provide the financial guarantees, such as insurance, for use in expanded environments and ranges. After you pass through this gate, you can now move on to unrestricted geography within design limitations, geofencing as needed, and testing within those unrestricted environments as defined at gate 1. Now, in preparation for public use or commercial release to the public, the AV developer would need to pass through gate 2. At gate 2, the developer would show all the things, I guess below it, I wrote above here. And again, that all the previous engineering and safety issues are resolved. There's new plans in place, and again, those financial guarantees. After you get through that, now, finally, you can move to unrestricted roads within the vehicle's limitations. The vehicle can only work where there's paving and painting, and on the road, then you can't go on dirt roads. General public use and unrestricted environments consistent with vehicle design. Now, through delegation of authority, composition of the certification board, industrial, governmental, and public interests would all be provided the opportunity to review, understand, and challenge that AV developmental plan with the idea that the public interest would be best served. The gated certification process, as we've described it, would also provide an audit trail, which would encourage improvements for all parties as experience with AV operations is gained by all of our stakeholders without imposing an unreasonable burden on those developers. So, again, this is just one model of addressing the many questions that remain open to finding ways to look out for consumer safety, while creating a pathway for the development of what could be truly revolutionary technology. Another way would be robust regulation, which brings me to a few significant items I didn't discuss. I didn't get any of the specifics of the Senate or House legislation on autonomous vehicles, but I'll note that neither mandate a framework for assuring safety prior to deployment in our neighborhoods. And some of you may be familiar, they actually preempt any local or state regulation that does. I also didn't get in any other areas we believe to be important and need to be addressed in any future law or regulations. For example, you and I need to prove we can see and how far we can see when we get our driver's license. There's no such requirement for autonomous vehicles at the moment. There's no vision test. Cybersecurity, as someone mentioned earlier, must be addressed up front. And we think prior to the massive undertaking and expenditures that will be included when we talk about V2X, particularly V2I. Privacy concerns abound in the context of a vehicle that stores where you go, how long you go for, and all the different routes you took to arrive. Making sure that safety and privacy work hand in hand is a lot easier said than done. Now, I chose not to address these today because half of you are probably asleep already, but not because the issues aren't important, but because if we're to start to create a framework to provide safe autonomy prior to deployment, we must be laying out the path by which we can achieve a level of agreed upon safety. So that path has to be focused on safety and simultaneously allow for commercial success and the mobility promised by the auto and technology industries to every community. But first, we have some gates to get through. So that's what I have. I'm happy to take some questions.
Shared at that was that in the 2017 Toyota Camry manual, 23 instances in which the automated emergency braking system would unexpectedly activate. So a good example of one of those things is you're coming up on a crest and there's a gantry and there's a sign up ahead, and that's going to fall into its view and perceive that as an object in the roadway and would slam on the brakes. So I'm curious, thinking about within your gates, this seems like a clearly identified limitation, parameter of how the technology works, and it's right there in the manual, but really what is good, informed process for users who are certainly not reading manuals ever.
Right. Well, so thank you for the question. The first thing I was going to say is how many people read the manual when they got there, right? I mean, we're regularly having this conversation with, these get put in the manual, and sort of like, yeah, it's good that it's in the manual, but that winds up just becoming an argument for lawyers, which I think is why it gets bigger and bigger every year. It's a real problem. I want to pause actually on the question of the consumer education to the note that automatic emergency braking, which we think should be standard on all new vehicles, there's no standard for automatic emergency braking. So what Nissan and Toyota and GM and Ford, whatever anyone is calling automatic emergency braking is going to vary from manufacturer to manufacturer, and there's no standard for how good it is or how ineffective it is, and that's a different problem. In terms of the consumer education piece, that's a major feature, not just of AEB, but of anything to do with autonomous technology. And I think what we're seeing right now is unfortunately, a live day-to-day test of how this technology works when you look at things like the Tesla's autopilot and some of the similar adaptive or advanced cruise controls, where people think they know what this thing does. It does pretty well in certain circumstances. It doesn't do well in other circumstances, and it winds up hitting, hopefully just getting you to a crash as opposed to getting you killed. But that is what we're seeing in some of the, so I think one of the pieces is how, particularly for level 2 and level 3, which we're not big fans of level 3 at all, but for level 2 vehicles, how are we going to educate consumers at the point of sale? And then if you want to think of that next stop, to the extent these aren't shared fleets, to the extent we're all buying our own, and the future will tell us where that goes, but if I'm buying my own automated vehicle and I then sell it to my neighbor, am I responsible for telling them how the AEB works? I'm not now, so I probably wouldn't be in the future, but we got to make sure that whether there's you need to take a driver's ed course, no matter how old you are before you operate this advanced technology, or there's some other feature, kind of like a setup wizard that we all now have. Sometimes we have to go through a new software, when we sit down at our laptop.
Hi, Alex Catalan from Polaris. I love the principle of having a step level safety board, if you will, or review team. Having just spent 25 years in automotive, I think there's a lot of distrust between regulations and safety groups and the elites themselves, and then part of the suppliers. So I have a twofold question. One is, what is the intention to include them? And part on the premise of the second question is, I don't think that a group outside of the developers or the developers themselves have a full comprehension yet of the use cases, the possibilities. I think if you implemented your stepwise testing, I honestly don't know that the industry has enough knowledge to know what goes into your last two steps. So my premise would be you need to make it very collaborative and maybe separate IP from use case and learnings. And what is the intention and how do you do this to bring that collaboration?
Sure. So and those are great. So the first one would be the more participation, the better. And we see this in third-party certification contexts in other industries. So it's not just having the government involved, but you do need a certain level of expertise before you start certifying anything. And so to not have the manufacturers involved would be entirely counterproductive. And so whether it's an association sort of context, so you have a group of manufacturers, or whether it's each individual manufacturer gets to be part and parcel of the certification of their product or of their vehicle, but not by themselves alone. I think that's something that could be worked out. But I would say that the idea, I think it sort of makes the point. The idea that people don't know how this thing is going to look at the end of those gates is exactly what we're concerned about. And I mentioned this briefly, but there's nothing else where we're testing, at least knowingly, at least at this scale, that involves life and death, where we're testing on people without them knowing that they're being tested on. And I'm not talking about the person who gets in the car. I'm talking about the people in the neighborhoods. And that does raise the question of, is that the best case scenario? This technology is going to transform almost everything, but the rush to get there, I mean, we should be getting it right as opposed to getting there first. And of course, it's a commercial enterprise, so the idea of getting there first has a lot of money involved with it. But the cost the fear that we have every time that there's a crash, sometimes including an autonomous vehicle was like literally sitting by the side of the road and just got hit. But that becomes a headline, is how much does public confidence take that step back? And as others have mentioned, the technology is hard, but is likely achievable. It's the human-machine interface, both literal and figurative, that is going to be amongst the hardest parts. And so to say, well, we'll figure it out later, just let us test. Again, we don't do that with, we don't do that with medical devices. We don't do that with drugs. We don't do that with toys that we give to kids that you could throw out. Why we do that with 2-ton or many more ton, tractor trailers is something that raises questions for us.
Recently, I bought a riding mower, and I went online because I'm a graying millennial to see how the YouTube videos were about this mower. And the top hits on the YouTube were how to disable the safety equipment, the seat, the backup, governor,
Right.
etc. So have you been thinking about principle or gates around tinkerers who will take these cars into their garage and start tinkering?
No, but I'll say it from the other perspective. I mean, the United States is a car culture. The ability to tinker with your car is, in some ways, we see as a constitutional right. How are people going to feel about that? That I will not be able. I mean, at the more sort of direct level that we interact with is most states have right to repair laws, that I can take my car wherever I want to repair it. I don't have to take it back to the dealer. Well, some of those things may become in conflict with the ability to secure the vehicle from a cyber standpoint, from the ability to make sure the sensors are working. That's a whole other Pandora's box that is starting to get cracked open. Then you add in I want to tinker with my own car. It's mine, I bought it. Well, that's a whole other question. Did I actually buy it, or am I just subscribing to it? There's a lot of questions that go there, but I think it adds on to if you're going to sell this as a safety technology, which some do, although some are a little more blunt, it's an upgrade of technology. But if you're going to sell it as the reason we need to push this out, the reason everyone needs to rejigger everything and spend all this money on it is because it's going to be about safety. Well, how are you going to ensure that it will remain safe? And I'm not hearing that conversation. And don't back up your mowers. People get killed every year. Thank you very much.